So I just concluded right before Thanksgiving, my fall season is what I call it. That's the season that I go on tour, essentially, talking on college campuses and at private events across the country. You know, from about mid-September to Thanksgiving, that's the busy season for most conservative events. That's when a lot of events are hosted, and I'm on the road, if not every week. I mean, some weeks it was twice a week. It was a very busy season this year. And I spoke at a couple college campuses along the way, and I noticed a pattern that was developing. So the way that the college campus tours often work is you go and you give a speech to the college campus, to the people that attend. It's often recorded or live streamed, and after you give your remarks, or after I give my remarks, students line up and they ask you questions. You're familiar with this. You've seen it. I mean, I think I even played one of my speeches from a week or two ago on the show, and those questions that they ask are on the record. They're videoed and they're aired, and everyone can see who asks the question and hear my answer. But what you don't see at these events is oftentimes after the on-camera portion, there's an off-the-record portion of these events, an off-the-record Q&A at these events. And I started to notice this fall that there's a pattern in the questions that I was getting asked off the record. They were questions that were very different from the questions that I was asked on the record. And one of the questions was coming specifically from the young men, not so much from the young women, but from the young men who were attending. And their question to me was asking if I knew why the Trump administration's mass deportations were off to what appears to feel like a slow start. And I say this in this particular phrasing. I'm repeating this question to you using this phrasing because there was often almost a hesitation in this question coming from these young men. Like, they didn't want to ask this question because a lot of them like Trump and they're very supportive of mass deportations, and they don't necessarily want to be critical, but when they crunch the numbers themselves, they notice the reality that the number of deportations coming from the Trump administration, if you extrapolate the rate of deportation that the Trump administration has been engaged in, it doesn't result in a number that's a lot higher than, say, the total number of deportations that the Obama administration conducted. And a lot of these young men are confused about why the rate of deportations is slow, why these mass deportations aren't happening. But the reason why they care is what's really interesting. The reason why they care is because of the implications that it's not just illegal immigration, but mass migration has had on their lives. A lot of these young men, and we talked about this in the lead up to the election last year, a lot of these young men in Gen Z are more conservative than the men of my generation, the millennial generation. These young men, you can call them red-pilled if you were, but they're embracing traditional values a little bit more. They want to get married. They want to have children. They are more religious. They want to buy a home. They want the stability of, what maybe our parents would have sought after. But the millennial generation verged away from that a little bit. Well, Gen Z wants that again. And yet these young men on these college campuses are facing a problem. As they get their college degree, thinking that they're going to be prepared for the workforce, they're going to be able to get a good job, have a paycheck, be able to support a wife and provide for a family, they're finding that that's actually not the case, that they're not able to, say, buy a home. Even if they have a decent paying job, they're not able to afford a down payment on a home because 25 years ago, they could have bought, a split-level starter home in a suburban neighborhood somewhere in the Midwest for $150,000 or $175,000, and they could afford a down payment on that. But today, that same house is like $375,000. And $375,000, even if they could maybe afford the monthly payment of a mortgage for a house of that price, they cannot afford the down payment. And so they feel very helpless. They feel very betrayed. They feel as though they're getting the short end of the stick because they look at what's happening in our country with immigration. They look at these millions upon millions, tens of millions of illegals who are taking up these homes. And they realize that the demand for these homes from these illegals is part of what drives the price so high that it's unaffordable to these young men. And I noticed this pattern of questioning from these young men because it's actually one of the reasons that some young men on the right are turning towards fringe characters turning towards influencers that, may accurately diagnose a grievance, but then prescribe poison as the antidote. But they're turning towards, young men turn towards those red pill influencers because the red pill influencers articulate the grievance of, hey, even if I do something right, even if I go to college, get a degree, get a good job, even if I want to get married and have a family and buy a house, it's not possible for me in America today because of these changing circumstances. And they blame, and rightly so, it's not the only factor, but it is one of the biggest factors. They blame the mass migration. And they wonder why President Trump has not engaged in these mass deportations at the rate that he had promised to do so. So all that being said, I'm noticing this pattern of questions from these young men, and I'm thinking to myself, this is what Charlie Kirk used to do. He used to speak to these young men on college campuses, and he wasn't just lecturing them. Charlie wasn't just there to shake his finger and wag his finger and tell them why they're wrong. Charlie listened. He listened to their grievances. He listened to what these young men were experiencing. And he didn't just listen to set himself up for a own the lib type of response. He listened so that he could help solve the problem. And one of the ways that Charlie helped solve problems was he communicated what young men were feeling to President Trump. Charlie was the messenger between this up-and-coming generation of young men and a White House who was actually interested in the well-being of these young people in our country. And I thought to myself, as I think, and you probably think too, every day, how much I miss Charlie. How much I miss his voice and his presence and the power of him being not just a listener, but a communicator. He would take these things to President Trump and he would so articulately and generously and persuasively make their case to the President of the United States. And it worked. President Trump listened to Charlie because Charlie had his finger on the pulse of young Americans. Charlie was the one who noted, not too long before his assassination, he noted that this isn't just anecdotal. If you look at this chart, we can put this tweet up. This was from August 14th, 2025, so less than a month before Charlie was killed. He posted this on X. He said, "This is the social compact breaking down. We need urgency to restore it." And it's a graph. It says the estimated percentage of 30-year-olds who are both married and homeowners. And the graph spans the years 1950 through 2025. Well, back in 1950, it was over 50% of 30-year-olds were both married and homeowners. And this declined slightly over the next 40 years to 1990. The rate was maybe 43%. So it declined by 10 percentage points in that space. But then after 1990, there is a precipitous fall. From 1990 to 2025, the number of the percentage of 30-year-olds who are both married and homeowners fell from maybe 43% all the way down to less than 10%, or right around 10%, which is shocking. I mean, you see the graph before you see that, the absolute precipice, these numbers plummeting. And Charlie identified why that happened. He said, we need urgency to restore these numbers back to where they were in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and all the way into the 90s. He said we need mass deportations. We need to stop the H-1B scam. We need to dramatically reduce legal immigration. We need to end chain migration and the visa lottery. We need to build 10 million homes for Americans, and we need to crush the college cartel. And he's right. He's right. And that's the root of the question. That's the root of this off-the-record question that these young men sometimes, it's not that they're embarrassed to ask it, but they ask it quietly. What is happening? President Trump, and early in his term, President Trump pledged to deport 1 million people per year. And as of December 1st of this year, the Trump administration has formally deported about half that, 550,000 to 600,000 non-citizens. This is through ICE and Border Patrol. Half. Now, you can make the argument, and we probably will talk about the role that these judicial insurrectionists, these judges, the radical leftist judicial activists play in trying to stymie the Trump administration. Of course, they play a role. The judges, I mean, you could even make the argument, and that would probably be a pretty good argument, that the judges are the resistance. They're the primary reason the Trump administration is not able to deport people at a faster rate than he is, because they're issuing these nationwide injunctions, which inferior court judges have no constitutional, legal, or legal authority to do. They're telling President Trump he's not allowed to do what he is allowed to do. And President Trump and his administration, respecting the rule of law the way that they do, are litigating that. They're appealing it and waiting for a court to tell them that they are allowed to do what they're actually allowed to do. But in the meantime, it, of course, hamstrings their ability to carry out these mass deportations.